I'd like to introduce Scott Wilkinson, who will be presenting Data Center Optics, Demand Explosion, and Technology Acceleration Beyond 400G. Scott is lead analyst at Cignal AI and has worked directly in the telecommunications industry for over 25 years. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Wilkinson to the Nanog stage.
Thank you very much. First of all, you'll notice that the title on the slides is different from the title that was in the agenda. That's either because the Nanog template doesn't allow you to put that many words on there, or because I forgot I had already submitted a title. Either way, you probably have not heard of Cignal AI. We are an industry analyst firm, which means we talk to the people who build stuff, and then we write up what's going on, what are the trends, what's happening. We don't typically work with people like Wall Street. We're dealing with the people who build optics, people who build transceivers, people who build the systems, people who build switches and routers, those kind of things. We primarily focus on optics. I personally got my degrees at Georgia Tech, so this is my hometown. Welcome to my hometown. I hope we treated you well. One thing I don't have, I have a little clicker. I thought I'd have a clicker somewhere. So what I'm going to talk about is what's happening with optics in the age of AI. AI is insane. It has broken all of the molds. It certainly made my job harder because in the past, you had an idea of what rationally would happen. If this happened in the past, something like it's probably going to happen in the future. There might be some things like Microsoft decides to build a different kind of data center, so things change a little bit. Meta decides to buy their own networks, that changes a little bit. But things generally are rational, and that's no longer true in the age of AI. Things have gone completely bonkers. And here's a good example of why. So this is what growth of data center optics looks like normally. This is 400 gig shipments starting back in 2020. And there's pretty regular growth for a couple of years there. It's about 35 to 40, between 30 and 50% every year. A little bit of variance. Different kinds of optics are popular depending on who's buying and who's not buying, but that's very rational. This is not. This is what's happening now. 300% year-over-year growth since third quarter of last year. That's absolutely crazy. So imagine everything that has to happen for 300% year-over-year growth to work. It's not just all the transceiver manufacturers ramping up their production, but it's the suppliers that they get stuff from ramping up. It's people who make lasers suddenly having to have more indium phosphide and gallium arsenide, all the things they use to build lasers, having that all have to happen. It's having the staff to ship these things around, to take them out of boxes, to physically install them into switches. All of this. We talked to a test equipment manufacturer in Japan who was terrified because they're being asked to triple their manufacturing capability to go onto manufacturing floors. And they said, if we triple our manufacturing capability and this goes away, we're stuck with a lot of capacity that we can't use. So people are scared, and what's interesting is any little thing can cause it to break. There was a slight problem for a while getting lasers, and things dropped. If you look in here at the second quarter of last year, there's this dip. At the time, that was freaking people out. That looked like a big dip. That was Amazon deciding they had bought enough transceivers and they just put a pause on for a quarter. And everyone was afraid the datacom industry was dying. Things have changed. Things have changed significantly, and we're all sort of trying to catch up. So the actual numbers here, about 6.5 million data center optics, and we only look at 400 gig and above. The stuff below that is not going into AI. It's 400 gig, it's 800 gig, and it's 1.6 coming out very soon. 6.5 million shipped in the third quarter of 24. That's the last quarter we have full data for because China has New Year's going on and they won't report until later in the year, probably somewhere in April. So 6.5 million in one quarter, that's more than shipped all of last year. One quarter, 6.5 million. The forecast by the end of this year is 22 million data center optics will ship. The vast majority going into AI. So if you're having trouble getting 800 gig or 400 gig optics, this is where they're going. They're all going right here. It's all going from AI deployments, going into these very, very large data centers. So you look at this and you say, okay, that's scary. What does that mean going forward? Are we going to continue to do that? And that's where we get into the little bit of the magic of what we do and making some guesses. And this is our forecast. And what you'll see is that there's this huge jump last year to this year. That's absolutely happening. That's real numbers. 250% when you look at the whole year last year versus the whole year in 2024, 23 to 24. Absolutely, definitely happened. 30 million modules will ship by 2028 though. And that's not a big jump. So you look at this and you say, it kind of slows down. Well, it's slowing down, but it's at an enormous rate. There are people out there who just use Google foo or excuse me, Excel foo, just like to go into Excel and say, well, did this last year, did this year, it'll be this next year. And I have seen some predictions showing these things going to 50, 60 million next year. It's just not physically possible, and I'll show you why in a second. There's just not enough money and power in the world to do that. But it's certainly growing to a huge number. And it doesn't really level off. If you look at the numbers in there, it's still growing at about 30% year over year. It's just growing from an enormous number. What is happening is we're shifting from lower speed to higher speed. So 400 gig is most of what is being used by data centers for AI right now. That very quickly is moving to 800 gig. The latest NVIDIA shipments that are out there, they're all 800 gig because AI just needs the fastest they can get. They don't care what it is. Cost really is no option. They need the fastest interface they can possibly put into there because they want as many as they can get connections. So the move from 400 to 800 gig is absolutely happening. What's moving very quickly after that is 1.6 terabits per second in an OSFP. I remember when 100 gig was a big deal. 1.6 terabits per second in an OSFP will be here into this year. Now, the only person who can deploy it, the only company in the world that can deploy it is NVIDIA. They're the only ones that have the 200 gig per lane PAM4 that you heard talked about earlier today that can interface directly with it. They have the only chips in the world for at least a year. So all the 1.6 you see, that gray at the top there, that is only NVIDIA. And in fact, for most of 26, that's only NVIDIA. Broadcom has a Tomahawk 6, their latest switch chip coming out with 200 gig per lane, kind of middle and end of next year if they hit all their milestones. But it is the B300 from NVIDIA that is the only one that can use it right now, and they will take as many as they can get. Because again, the only thing that matters is the fastest speeds we can get. What that means is that the others start to kind of drop off. 400 gig drops off, 800 gig certainly drops off fast, because 400 gig is a nice number that people like. 400 gig lines up very well with the outside the data center bandwidth. 400 gig is a nice 4 times transition from 100 to 400. Microsoft said transitioning by 2 is not something they're interested in doing. You just don't get enough bang for the buck. A 4 times transition they'll do. So 400 gig looks pretty good. 800 gig is kind of a weird in-between number. If it wasn't for AI, the only people in the world probably who'd be using 800 is Meta, because they do a 2x400, which is kind of an odd way of doing things. But because of this enormous demand for the fastest we can get, 800 is done very well. And in fact, there's some data centers, Amazon and Google, 800 gig inside. Sorry, this microphone just fell off. Looking at doing 400 and 800 gig inside the data center. Here we go. There is some forecast risk here. One of the forecast risks is that 1.6 may actually get deployed a little faster than this. Looking at the history of what NVIDIA has been able to do, their transition from 400 to 800 took a little while. The transition from 800 to 1.6 is probably going to take a little while. There are data center operators out there who are putting in 800 gig, which may cause that to last a little longer. But generally, this seems to make sense in terms of the number of units shipped. Now, this doesn't mean bandwidth doesn't go up, because we're shifting to higher speeds, because that means more bandwidth. That's certainly going to happen. And with bandwidth comes dollars, and that's this one. If you are in the business of selling these things, you're looking at a $14 billion market by 2028 just for the optics. That doesn't count the switches, that doesn't count the GPUs, that doesn't count the power supplies, that doesn't count liquid cooling, that doesn't count everything else that goes into this. 14 billion by 2028 just for these. You can see it's continuing to go up and to the right. The problem, of course, is that as it goes up, if you're making these devices, the dollars per gig also goes down. That's probably the more interesting line on this, especially for most people in this room. Dollars per gig is dropping pretty fast. What we're being told is that the manufacturers are being given a mandate that twice a year, they have to reduce their price between 5 and 10%. So if you remember earlier, I said you can't get these even if you want them. Can you imagine any market in the world that is on allocation and the prices are going down? That doesn't happen. That breaks everything with economics. Can you imagine going to a store and saying, I'd like to buy 10 of these, and they say, you can't get them today, but if you come back tomorrow, I can give you 5, but they'll be cheaper. Never happens. That's what's happening here. So the goal from the industry is to try to get to 50 cents per gig. And you can see that over to the right, we're probably going to get there. Now, this is a blended cost of 400, 800, and 1.6. This doesn't mean you're going to go out and buy a 1 gig transceiver for 50 cents. It means that you can buy a 1.6 terabit transceiver for about $8,000. So that's where we're trying to get to, is 50 cents per gig. The problem with these large numbers, when you talk to the people who are making the transceiver, you got a mic over here? Oh, I'm back. I said a bad word. Got muted. Not the first time. The problem when you talk to the people who are making these, you would think that they would say, you're making 22 million of these things. You're making a lot of money on them. Shouldn't this be a great business to be in? And what they'll tell you instead is, well, we're not really making 22 million of the same thing. We're making different ones for every hyperscaler. Every one of them is going to their suppliers and having them build something unique, something that no one else is using. So again, if you're trying to buy one of these transceivers we're talking about that are going into AI, you cannot, because Amazon has a very specific kind of transceiver that they make Innolight and Coherent and others build for them. Google has a very specific one because they're doing optical cross connects, which we can talk about if anybody cares. That means bidirectionality and a little bit higher power and making sure you can handle reflections. That is a specific design that is unique to them. They have intellectual property in it, and you can't buy it. So if you are now a designer who's building these things, if you have a big manufacturing floor and you think, okay, I can run 22 million of these things through here, I'll get economies of scale, I'll run them as fast as I can, you can't do that. You got to run 5 or 6 different lines. And that's not accounting for that's not even taking into account at all the commodity ones that you offer for sale on your website. Those are different, and that's why you can't buy those, because they are building these as fast as they can. NVIDIA builds them internally with a manufacturer out of Mexico. Fabrinet, they're building as many as they can. They can't build enough of them, so they've had to go find other people to build for them. Again, just you can't get them. They're becoming as fast as possible. It's not a great business to be in because the price keeps going down. But if you have a choice, if you're given the option, this happens all the time, of either expanding your capability and trying to take advantage of this, or shrinking your capability and not worried about it as much, everyone always expands their capability. So across the world, what we're seeing is expansion. So the question is this close to reality? And this is an interesting way of looking at it. What we looked at was hyperscale CapEx of the biggest hyperscalers in North America. The ones in China are about 20% of this, so they don't influence it quite as much. And if you look at all the money that's being made in datacom, from the lasers to the modules to everything else, as a percentage of what they're spending, in the past it's been about 3.5%. It's going up, which you'd expect, they're doing more AI, to about 6 to 7%. This is based on our forecast. If they're going to double, like some people have said, this would go to 20%, 15 to 20% of their total CapEx being spent on optics. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it can happen. What instead is probably going to happen is maybe the CapEx has to go up. And if the CapEx goes up, then our forecast may be wrong. And this morning, Facebook said, Alphabet said that they're going to be increasing their CapEx by 20% over estimates. So we could be off by about 20%, but it's certainly not going to double. But this is an interesting way to look at it, and this is the way we try to justify the fact that it does look like it's kind of flattened out at an enormous new number way out there in the future. I just realized I spelled hyperscale wrong on that one, but nobody noticed. Data center interconnect between the data centers. So when this started happening, our thought was that the data center interconnect between them wasn't really going to be affected all that much, because when you do training on these models, it has to be really close together. In fact, the speed of light is already too slow. You want to build them as close together as you can. You want to get the latency down. You want to get as much speed as you can. So going between sites, that just doesn't really work. The problem is we've hit reality. We've hit how much power can a data center suck, and how much room can you put in all this stuff in a data center. And we're starting to hit those limits. And so not only can you no longer put everything from one AI cluster in a data center, you can't put it in the same power grid. So it's going to have to be somewhere else. And so there's been research done recently of saying, how can we take training, this is not inference, the training where you're training these modules, how can we separate them by as much as 100 kilometers and still have them work? And that's starting to happen just because it has to, because you can't physically get them all to work. And the type of device that's used most for that is something called 400ZR. If you're not familiar with it, it is a coherent pluggable module that plugs into a switch. But it allows you to go 40 to 80 kilometers. If you put amplifiers on it, you can go even further. 800 gigs is going to go 1,000 kilometers. You can go long distances with these, but they fit directly into a switch or router. They just take more power. And if you track what's been going on with those, they've been very popular. They've been primarily popular because Microsoft in particular decided rather than building one data center, they build lots of little data centers. So they used a lot of these. Now everybody else is kind of on that bandwagon. They doubled from 23 to 24. They're going to continue to grow very, very quickly as people find a way to use training over distance, and they put a data center anywhere you can get them power. If you saw the announcement about Tesla was going to put in a 1 million GPU cluster, accepting that that's hyperbole, that's 2 nuclear power plants. There's no way they're going to build that in one spot. It's going to have to be spread out. And the more that happens, the more there's an impact on between the data centers. So you'll start seeing that well out into the network. So all this power that they're taking, we get asked, what about alternatives? What are things people are doing to try to reduce the power just to the optics? There's a lot of stuff being done throughout the network, but what about the optics in particular? And there's this one particular topic that shows up a lot called LPO. If you haven't heard of it before, it means linear pluggable optics. The way pluggable optics generally work is there's a switch ASIC, the thing in blue there, it has a little DSP on it. That DSP is intended to drive across the backplane and maybe drive some passive copper, but that's about it. So the pluggable optics on the end have their own DSP that receives that, clean it up, make it ready for optical, send it to the optical engine and across a fiber. Well, the latest ASICs have really, really good DSPs. And some folks realize that you can actually take that DSP out of the optics and in some cases drive it directly across the backplane and it works. And that reduces the power of those optics by about half. And there's Andy Bechtolsheim, if you don't know him from Arista, he's one of the founders, one of the only billionaires that ever returns my phone calls. He's just a really cool engineer. He argues for this all the time, that this in a gigawatt data center is megawatts worth of power. The problem is that's still only a small percentage. The bigger problem is when you take that DSP out, these don't always work. If you have a slightly different kind of link, if the link's a little bit too long, a little bit too short, has something else on the end, they don't always work. If you're deploying 22 million of these a year, they got to work every time. And so LPO has been a really interesting topic for about 3 years. No one's deployed any of them. Zero. But there's still work on it. Andy will be talking at OFC, last I saw, 3 different times about the benefits of LPO and why it's going to work eventually. There are some standards bodies, but they're not really standards bodies, they're multi-source agreements coming together. But it looks like something called LRO makes more sense, where you have a retimer on one side and not on the other side. That may clean these things up. But the basic problem is that there are other issues that need to be solved within AI clusters first, and this just has not been a priority. There's some rumors NVIDIA might do it inside their nodes. So if you look at places that might get used, I like using the pain scale. This is the ones they put in hospitals of, are you not experiencing pain to is this really, really painful? Not experiencing pain, an active optical cable. This is a cable, it's fiber, it's got transceivers on both ends, you know what's on both ends, you know what's in the middle. Yeah, LPO works great in those, reduces the power. Those aren't used a whole lot though. Beyond that, if you go to maybe a homogeneous data center that's all used for AI and you know what it is, something that NVIDIA would build and then hand to you, maybe you could get it to work there. But anything beyond that, if your network has multiple different types of things in it, if it has different lengths of fiber, if it has different types of transceivers, it's not going to work. It's just not a solution that's going to work. So what are some other options? This is something else we've been hearing a lot about, and that's the idea that maybe we're going to get to the point where those coherent optics that go 40 to 80 kilometers, they're really cool. We're selling a lot of them now. I mean, they're the fastest selling coherent optic of all time, by far, 3 to 4 times more than anything ever. Maybe you could move those inside the data center for replacing LR. And we get a lot of questions about this because the folks who build Coherent really want this to happen, and there's been a couple of announcements. Ciena and Marvell have announced some products. The problem is the way we do optics inside the data center right now, which is PAM4, IMDD, intensity modulation, that's the way that we do it right now. That's really low power, it's really easy to do, it's really cheap. And if you can do it, you'll keep doing it. And the reason everybody thought Coherent was going to come into the data centers, we thought when we went to 200 gig per lane, each laser going at 200 gig PAM4, that we probably wouldn't be able to get the distances necessary inside the data center. But the IMDD guys aren't giving up without a fight. They're saying they can get to almost 10 kilometers. Most data center optics, 500 meters. The other half, about 2 kilometers. Google, with their optical switches, says maybe 6. So IMDD works fine at 200 gig per lane for everything inside the data center. Now, this is excluding campus. There's this idea that you might have some campuses where you build them really close together, again, for training because you just don't have enough room in one space. And that's what those coherent light kind of stuff might work for. That's really kind of outside the data center. But inside the data center, no. And we kind of use this as an intelligence test when someone asks us, when do we think coherent is going to be inside the data center? Remember I was talking about the goal of getting to 50 cents per gig on data center optics? These, on a good day, if we're really lucky, may get to $3 per gig. 6 times more expensive. The coherent DSP adds latency, it adds power, a lot of power. These are not going to replace your traditional optics. They're really cool. They are a great thing. I'm glad they were invented. They are terrific for connecting data centers together, but you're not going to use them inside your data center unless you have some very specific case. And those are very much corner cases. Well, the final thing that we get asked a lot about is something called co-packaged optics. And that is taking LPO to its logical extreme. Let's get rid of the DSP, and then let's take the optical engine off the pluggable optics and put it right next to the ASIC, co-packaged in the same package. We use an external laser to drive it. It's a silicon photonics little device. It's built out of the same CMOS that everything else is built out of. Absolutely lower power. There's some issues with this. It's been around. It's been the next greatest thing for about 3 years. It's always going to be 3 years away. It's been 3 years away for 5 years. It's always the next greatest thing. But it's starting to look like it may actually be useful. There have been a couple of demonstrations. Broadcom did a demonstration. Cisco did a demonstration, and then they kind of shelved it and said, we don't think anybody wants this right now. The biggest problem right now is you can only buy it for one person. The other problem is if anything on it fails, you got to replace the whole switch. Now, what people who are building it will say is we're building it out of silicon, so it probably won't fail that much. It shouldn't be a problem. But if you're used to putting in pluggable optics and replacing those when they fail, this makes people a little itchy. But the biggest problem probably overall is that if you're a hyperscaler, when you go to your optics vendors, you can play 2 or 3 of them across each other, and you can get really good pricing on your optics. You don't need this right now. You lose some of that leverage. And that's one of the reasons it hasn't really taken off yet. There's some positive signs. There's a standard developed for that external laser. You plug this laser, and it's really cool if you haven't ever seen one of these things, because you're now plugging a laser in that's shining into the box. So you have to have a connection that doesn't turn on the laser until it's completely inside, because it's a pretty dangerous laser, and it has a power connection and an optical connection in the same connector. It's really, really complex stuff. There's a standard developed for that now, and they are being developed, and the company Lumentum, who makes a bunch of these, says people are starting to buy them. So there are demonstrations being done. People are trying to figure out a way to make CPO work. TSMC, which is where most of the chips in the world are made, out of Taiwan, they announced that they've got a deal with all the Taiwan semiconductor people getting together and trying to build an infrastructure, an ecosystem to make this work. So it won't be a product at that point, because there is a product, by the way. Broadcom builds this thing through a company called Micus Networks. You could buy it if you wanted to. TSMC says it won't be a product, it'll be a process. That their customers will come to them and say, I want a switch built, and instead of electrical outputs, I want optical outputs. Or I want 80% optical and 20% electrical. And you'll be able to specify that when you go to the manufacturer, rather than being something that you have to go to Broadcom and buy a huge box from them. You'll be able to do it. Anybody will be able to do it. That's where it looks like this is going. TSMC has said this is 3 to 5 years out. There were some reports that came out about 2 weeks ago, badly translated from Chinese, that said that NVIDIA would be doing this year. That is absolutely not true. They can't possibly. But I do suspect that at their big GTC conference next month, they will announce that they're looking at this. They got all the money in the world, they can look at everything. But they will be probably doing something with this within their bays, because they have a density problem, they have a power problem. This is an interesting way to solve it. So it looks like this is something that will happen. It's probably going to be 10 years before you go out and buy a CPO switch to put into your network. In the meantime, pluggable optics work really, really well. This growth that's happening right now eventually will help everybody, because there will be extra capacity out there. You'll see the move from 100 to 400 be a little bit easier to do, a little bit easier to find parts. The 400 to 800 or even to 1.6 will be coming not too far behind. It's across all speeds right now that the growth is happening, but 400 gig is still doing incredibly well. 1.6 really can't come fast enough. It'll be fun to see how that happens, and then what comes next? Probably 3.2. 3.2 terabits in a device. I'm not sure exactly how it'll be done. We have some ideas, but that'll be fun. Bandwidth and revenue are continuing to increase. We like to say when you're inside a bubble, it's really hard to see where the edge of the bubble is. This feels like a bubble. People who were around in the 90s and the 2000s remember this kind of stuff from before. The difference is these guys have all the money in the world. They have just a huge amount of cash. So for the next few years, they are going to compete to do this. I was expecting, and I'll go ahead and preempt it, a question about what's happening in China with their deep AI coming out and saying that they can do it for a lot less money. I mean, that looks like it directly runs into this. And it's true, it could. If they really have found a way to do it cheaper, that's a big deal. But what the hyperscalers have said is if they have really found a way through software to do this more efficiently, we're still going to run it on the big clusters. Because we have to find a way to compete against each other. We're all trying to build the God brain. And if you found a way to do it more efficiently, that's great. We're still going to put it on a 1 million GPU cluster and see what we can do with it. The limitation may at some point be having enough data to input into it. But Meta has said repeatedly, the only way to get better results is to build bigger clusters. They're going to keep building them. The AI push for bandwidth is going to be outside the data center as well as inside the data center. We'll certainly start seeing that. For the next few years, it's going to be traditional pluggables that benefit mostly from this. I have 4 minutes left. I love having a clock. That's so cool. If there are any questions. And I can't see anything, so.
Come on, you guys, step up and give him some questions.
Whoa. It's always interesting to come talk to this conference because we tend to get stuck with the Googles and the Microsofts of the world and what they talk about with their 400 gig needs and their 800 gig needs and 1.6. And every time I come to one of these conferences, I have somebody pull me aside and say, look, the 100 gig pluggables that are coming out Coherent, here's how we're going to use them inside of our network because we have bandwidth problems between floors. Application I hadn't thought of, it was really cool. So it's always interesting to hear from other folks. Yes?
Hi, Chris Woodfield, unaffiliated. Next speaker, actually. On your list of the various customers for these optics, I didn't see OpenAI. Are they a significant customer at this point?
They're about to be. They just got, what, $2 billion or something like that?
I guess.
Oracle wasn't listed on there either because Oracle just started building their AI nodes. There are a lot of tier 2s. OpenAI was never a tier 1 part of that. They are about to be. With the amount of money that it looks like, if the money actually gets implemented the way that it looks like it is, yeah, they're about to break the mold again, yeah.
They'll get a column on the graph.
Yeah, they'll get a column on the graph. Let's start tracking them too.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Fergus, do we have anything from online? Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your talk, Scott.
Anytime.
Dr. Wilkinson.